The digital clock on the cold stone wall flickers, its red light bleeding into the shadows of the small cell. 4 hours. 0400. The numbers glow like fresh blood, reflecting in the dark, still eyes of Sung-woon. To anyone else, the ticking sound would be a nightmare, but to the man they called the Butcher of Gangnam, it was just a countdown. A heavy, distorted thumping fills the air, the sound of a heartbeat, slow and steady, echoing through the speakers of the maximum security wing. It is the only sound in a place where even the guards are afraid to whisper. Sung-woon sits perfectly still, his back straight, his hands resting on a cold metal table. He looks like a king waiting for a meeting, not a prisoner waiting for the end.
In his life on the streets of Busan, Sung-woon had signed 412 death warrants. He had ordered hits with a simple nod of his head while eating dinner. He never blinked. He never felt a single spark of regret. To him, people were just numbers on a balance sheet, and when those numbers didn't add up, he erased them. He always believed he was the one who held the pen, the one who decided who lived and who stayed in the dark. But as the clock shifts to 035959, the reality of the room begins to press in. For the first time in 50 years, Sung-woon is not the judge. He is the one being judged. He has one final execution to witness, and this time, he will be the star of the show. He is ready for the rope. He is ready for the silence. He has lived a violent life, and he expects a violent end. He thinks he has seen everything there is to see in the world of crime. However, there is something he does not know. The guards standing outside his door are not just keeping him in, they are keeping a secret. There is a thin, yellow file sitting on the edge of the table, just inches from his hand. The guards hadn't spoken a word when they dropped it there, but their eyes were full of something Sung-woon hadn't seen before: pity. Inside those pages lies a truth that has been buried for 15 years. It is a discovery that will strip away his armor and break his iron heart. As he reaches out a steady hand to open the folder, he doesn't realize that the next 4 hours will be longer than his entire life. He thinks he is prepared for death, but what he is about to read will make the executioner's chair feel like a mercy he hasn't earned. The Butcher of Gangnam is about to find out that some ghosts don't stay buried, and some crimes are too heavy for even a monster to carry.
Before the cold walls of the prison and the ticking red clock, there was the city of Busan. In those days, Sung-woon did not just live in the city, he owned it. He sat at the very top of a tall glass tower, looking down at the lights below, like a king looking at his subjects. People called him the Butcher, but he saw himself as a businessman. To him, the streets were just a giant machine, and he was the only one who knew how to turn the gears. At the height of his power, Sung-woon was a shadow king. He did not wear a crown, but everyone bowed when he entered a room. He treated a massive gang war involving hundreds of men like it was just a simple board meeting. While rival gangs fought in the rainy alleys with pipes and knives, Sung-woon sat in a quiet 5-star restaurant. He sat alone at a long wooden table, slowly eating expensive sushi. The fish was fresh, and his suit was perfectly pressed.
A nervous young man came to his table to tell him that the war was getting out of hand. The messenger's hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold his notes. Sung did not look up from his meal. He simply dipped a piece of tuna into soy sauce and took a bite. Without a word, he picked up a napkin, wiped his mouth, and gave a small nod to his bodyguard standing in the corner. That one nod was a death sentence for 3 men across town. To Sung, ordering a hit was as easy as ordering a glass of water. He felt untouchable, as if the laws of normal men could never reach his high tower. But Sung was not just powerful, he was terrifying. He kept his empire under control with a strict rule of silence. He believed that words were dangerous things that could bring down a kingdom. If a person spoke against him or told a secret to the police, Sung did not just punish them, he made sure they could never speak again. There were stories whispered in the docks about men who tried to betray him and woke up unable to make a sound. He wanted the city to be quiet. He wanted everyone to know that even thinking about a protest was a mistake. In those years, Sung-woon lived in a world where no one dared to look him in the eye. He had all the money in the world and enough power to move mountains. He thought he had erased every mistake from his past. He thought he was a god who could never fall. He did not know that while he sat on his iron throne, a tiny seed was growing in the cracks of his empire. He was so busy watching his enemies that he never noticed the one person who would eventually bring his whole world crashing down. He was the king of the silence, but even he could not quiet the truth forever. The night the empire fell, the sky over Busan was black and heavy with rain. Sung-woon sat in the back of his black car, watching the raindrops race down the window. He felt safe. He felt like the king he had always been. Behind him, 3 other cars filled with his most loyal brothers followed closely. These were men he had fed, men he had paid, and men he had protected for years. He trusted them because he thought money could buy loyalty. He was wrong.
Suddenly, the quiet night was shattered by the scream of sirens. Blue and red lights flashed in the rearview mirror, reflecting off the wet pavement. Sung-woon didn't panic. He leaned forward and told his driver to go faster. The engine roared and the chase began. They flew through the narrow streets, splashing through deep puddles, tires screeching around every corner. Sung looked back, expecting his brothers to block the police cars. He expected them to fight, to ram the officers off the road, or to create a distraction. Instead, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The 3 cars behind him didn't speed up. They slowed down. One by one, they pulled over to the side of the road, turning off their headlights. They weren't fighting the police. They were stepping out of the way. They had opened the gates and let the hunters in. His brothers had sold him out for a chance to take his throne. In the dark of the rainy night, Sung realized he was completely alone.
The police surrounded his car near the Han River. Dozens of officers pointed their weapons at him, shouting for him to get out with his hands up. The rain soaked through his expensive suit in seconds, but Sung didn't look like a defeated man. He stepped out of the car slowly, a cold smirk growing on his face. He didn't fight. He didn't run. He even offered his wrists to the handcuffs as if they were expensive jewelry. He looked at the lead detective and laughed quietly. In his mind, this was just a game. He believed he owned the judges. He believed his lawyers would find a way to make the evidence disappear by morning. He thought his money was a shield that no prison could ever break. As they pushed him into the back of the police van, he was still smiling. He thought he was just going to a holding cell for a few hours. He had no idea that the judges had already turned their backs on him. He didn't know that this was the last time he would ever feel the rain on his face as a free man. The butcher had finally been caught, and for the first time in his life, his money was useless. The time for games had ended. The high glass towers and the expensive suits were gone, replaced by a gray prison uniform and a room that felt as cold as a refrigerator. It was finally execution day. Sung-woon sat on a hard wooden stool, staring at the digital clock on the wall. The numbers were bright red, slowly counting down. There were no more lawyers to call and no more judges to buy. This was the reality of the law, and it was much colder than he had ever imagined. On the table in front of him sat his last meal. It was a bowl of warm soup and rice, the kind of simple food his mother might have made him a long time ago.
but Sung didn't touch it. The steam rose into the air and then disappeared, leaving the food to grow cold. He wasn't hungry. He had spent his life eating the finest food in the world, and now even the smell of the rice felt like a heavy weight. He just sat there, his hands folded, waiting for the clock to strike the final hour. The silence in the room was the loudest thing he had ever heard. Outside the bars, 2 guards stood perfectly still. In the old days, these same men would have smiled at him and taken envelopes full of cash to look the other way. They used to call him sir and bow when he walked by. Now they stood like statues. Their eyes were fixed on the floor or the wall behind him. They wouldn't even look him in the face. It was as if he were already a ghost, and they were afraid that looking at him would bring them bad luck. Sung closed his eyes and took a deep breath. To his surprise, he wasn't shaking. He wasn't even scared. Deep down, he felt a strange sense of boredom. He had spent his whole life surrounded by death. He had seen people beg for their lives, and he had seen them go quietly. To him, death was just the end of a long, tired story. He had won 1,000 battles and lost the final one. He was ready to get it over with. He thought there were no more surprises left in this world. He thought his heart was a stone that nothing could ever break.
Then the heavy iron door creaked open. The sound was sharp and painful in the quiet room. Sung didn't move, thinking it was just a priest or a guard coming to check the time. But the person who stepped inside was his old lawyer, the one man who knew all of Sung's darkest secrets. The lawyer wasn't carrying a pardon or a deal. He was carrying a thin yellow folder, and his face was pale. For the first time that day, Sung felt a tiny spark of curiosity. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting the lawyer's nervous gaze. The boredom he felt a moment ago began to wash away, replaced by a strange feeling in his chest. The final hour was approaching, but the story was not over yet. The lawyer did not sit down. He stood by the steel table, his shadow long and thin against the gray floor. He looked at Sung with eyes that were full of sadness and a little bit of fear. Without saying a word, he reached into his bag and pulled out a thin yellow folder. It looked ordinary, like any other piece of paper, but the lawyer handled it as if it were made of glass. He slowly slid the document across the cold metal table until it stopped right in front of Sung's hands. Sung looked down at the file. "Is this a pardon?" he asked, his voice low and raspy from hours of silence. "Did you find a judge who still likes money?" The lawyer shook his head. He leaned in closer, his voice a sharp whisper that seemed to cut through the cold air. "I'm not here to save your life, Sung," he said. "It is too late for that. The machines are already being tested. The guards are ready. I am here because of a promise I made to a witness. I am here to show you what you actually killed." Sung felt a cold chill run down his spine. He had killed many things, men, reputations, even entire families. He thought he knew every ghost that followed him. He reached out and flipped open the cover of the file. Inside was an old police report, a few grainy black and white photos, and a copy of a birth certificate. As Sung began to read the first page, something strange happened. His hands, the same hands that had held weapons without a single tremor, began to shake. At first it was just a small twitch in his fingers, but soon his whole arm was trembling. His eyes locked onto a name and a date from 15 years ago. It was a name he had tried to forget, a name belonging to a woman he had once loved before he became the Butcher.
He stared at a photo of a young girl with bright, curious eyes and a small scar on her chin. He remembered that scar. He remembered the night in the cafe when the bullets started flying. He remembered ordering his men to clean up the mess and leave no one alive. He had been told the job was done. He had been told the witnesses were gone. But as he looked at the recent photos in the file, photos of a teenager standing outside a courthouse, he realized the truth. The girl had lived. She had survived the very nightmare he had created. Sung's breath became short and fast. The room felt like it was spinning. He wasn't looking at a police report anymore. He was looking at a mirror of his own soul. He had spent his life building a wall of power to keep the world out, but this tiny piece of paper had just knocked the whole wall down. The man who feared nothing was finally terrified, and the executioner hadn't even entered the room yet. The red light of the prison clock seemed to fade away as Sung's mind traveled back 15 years. He remembered a rainy afternoon in a small, crowded cafe. Back then, he was still climbing the ladder of power, and he was eager to show how cold he could be. He had sent his men to deal with a rival who was hiding among the normal families eating lunch. It was supposed to be a quick job, but it turned into a nightmare of breaking glass and screaming people.
In the middle of the chaos, a young woman was caught in the crossfire. She wasn't part of the gangs. She was just a mother trying to protect her child. Sung remembered standing at the door after the shooting stopped, smelling the gunpowder and the spilled coffee. He didn't feel sad for the woman. He only felt annoyed that there were so many people who had seen his face. He didn't want any loose ends. He looked at his men and gave a simple, cruel order. Clean it up. Make sure no one talks. He had walked away before the job was finished, stepping over the broken plates as if they were nothing. He told himself that the witnesses were gone. He lived the next 15 years believing that the cafe was just a tiny mistake he had fixed with more violence. He had forgotten the woman's face and the way the room sounded when the music stopped playing and the crying began. He thought he was safe because dead people cannot tell stories. But the file in his shaking hands told a different story. As he looked at the police drawings, he saw something he had missed that day. Underneath a table covered by a long blue cloth, a tiny pair of shoes had been peeking out. A little girl, no more than 4 years old, had been squeezed into the smallest corner of the room. She had covered her ears and closed her eyes, but she had heard everything. She had heard his voice. She had heard the order that ended her mother's life.
She hadn't just survived, she had become a ghost that followed him for over a decade. While Sung was building his towers of glass and steel, she was growing up in the shadows. She didn't go to the police right away. Instead, she watched him. She learned his habits, his friends, and his secrets. She was the one who had slowly whispered the truth into the ears of the right people. She was the reason the loyal brothers had turned on him. She was the reason the gates had opened for the police. Sung stared at the photo of the girl as she looked today. Her eyes were hard and sharp, just like his. She had spent 15 years waiting for this exact moment. He realized now that he hadn't been caught by a mistake or a better criminal. He had been brought down by a child who had never forgotten his voice. The cleanup he had ordered so long ago had left behind the one person who would eventually take everything from him. Sung felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. He stared at the name on the birth certificate again, his eyes burning. The woman in the cafe, the one he had ordered his men to finish off, wasn't just a random witness. Her name was Hana. She was the only woman he had ever truly loved, back when he was just a young man with big dreams and a kinder heart. She had left him years ago, disappearing without a word because she couldn't stand the violence that was taking over his soul. He had searched for her for a long time, but he never found her. He never knew she had been hiding in that small cafe, trying to live a quiet life far away from his shadow.
But the truth got even darker. As he flipped the page, he saw a medical record that made his heart stop. The little girl who had been hiding under the table, the one with the bright eyes and the small scar, was born exactly 9 months after Hana had left him. Sung's breath hitched in his throat. The girl wasn't just a survivor. She was his own daughter. He had a child. He had a daughter he never knew existed, a part of himself that he had spent 15 years trying to destroy. The cruelty of his life hit him all at once. For over a decade, Sung had been obsessed with finding the ghost who survived the cafe shooting. He had told his men to hunt her down. He had spent millions of dollars on private detectives and hitmen to find the girl and erase her so she could never testify against him. Every time he felt like someone was watching him from the dark, he had sent more men to find and kill her. He had been a monster hunting his own blood. He had spent his daughter's entire childhood trying to take her life to protect his dirty empire. He thought about all the nights he had sat in his glass tower, feeling powerful and safe. While he was drinking expensive wine and counting his money, his own daughter was running for her life from the men he had sent. She had grown up in fear, moving from house to house, always looking over her shoulder because her own father wanted her dead. He hadn't just killed her mother, he had spent 15 years trying to finish the job.
Sung-woon dropped the file onto the steel table. The loud smack of the paper sounded like a gunshot in the silent cell. He looked at his shaking hands and felt a wave of sickness wash over him. He had always thought he was a king who could control everything, but he was really just a blind man who had broken his own heart. The butcher had finally met the one victim he couldn't live with. He wasn't just a criminal anymore. He was a father who had declared war on his own child. The red clock on the wall ticked again, but now the time felt like a heavy chain pulling him down into the dark. Sung-woon's mind was screaming. The walls of the cell felt like they were closing in on him, tighter and tighter with every tick of the clock. He grabbed the lawyer's sleeve, his fingers digging into the expensive fabric. "Where is she?" he begged, his voice cracking. "Bring her here. Tell her I have money. I have bank accounts she can't even dream of. I can make her the richest woman in the country. She can change her story. She can tell the judges it was a mistake. Tell her I'll give her everything if she just helps me get a pardon." He was frantic now, the cool and calm mafia boss completely gone. He was willing to trade every building he owned and every bar of gold just for a few more years of life. He thought that everyone had a price. He thought that even a daughter's hate could be bought with enough diamonds and silk. He paced the small room like a trapped animal, waiting for the lawyer to pick up a phone and make the call. He wanted to look into her eyes and see the bloodline he had tried to erase. The lawyer did not move. He did not reach for a phone. Instead, he pulled a small digital recorder from his pocket and placed it on the cold metal table. "She knew you would say that," the lawyer said quietly. "She doesn't want your money, Sung. She doesn't want your buildings. She just wanted you to hear this." He pressed a button, and the room was suddenly filled with the sound of a young woman's voice. Her voice was not filled with anger. She wasn't screaming or crying. She sounded calm, like a calm sea before a storm. "I didn't testify to kill a monster," she said, and Sung felt the words hit him like a physical blow. "I didn't do this to be mean or to get even. I testified because I needed to bury a father I never had. You were never a man to me. You were just a shadow that followed me in the dark, trying to take my breath away." Sung stopped pacing. He stood frozen in the middle of the room as his daughter's voice continued. "If I save you now, I become your accomplice. I become just like the men who took my mother away. But if I ask for your death out of hate, I become your shadow. I would be just as violent as you are.
So I am not choosing revenge. I am choosing the law. I want you to die as a criminal, not as my kin. To the world, you are a monster. To me, you are nothing. I am letting the law finish what you started."
The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was heavier than any silence Sung had ever known. He realized then that his millions of dollars were just pieces of paper. His daughter wasn't a criminal like him. She was better than him. She had used the truth to win, and there was no way to bribe the truth. Sung sank back onto his wooden stool, his head in his hands. He finally understood that he wasn't just losing his life. He had already lost the only person who could have given his life a reason. He was a king without a kingdom, and a father without a child. With only 60 minutes left on the red digital clock, the air in the cell felt thin. Sung-woon sat in the heavy silence and realized that his great empire was nothing but a pile of ash. For years he had climbed a mountain of power, only to find that the top was empty and cold. He looked at his hands and saw the blood of the past, but for the first time he didn't want to hide it. He knew he couldn't save his life, and he knew his daughter would never call him father. The only thing left to do was to burn down the world he had built. He did not call for a priest. He did not get on his knees to pray for a soul he had ignored for decades. Instead, he grabbed a stack of paper and a pen. He began to write as if his life depended on it, his hand moving fast across the pages. He wasn't writing a letter of love. He was writing a map of the darkness. He listed every secret offshore bank account hidden in distant islands. He wrote down the names of the corrupt judges who had taken his money to let killers go free. He listed the locations of the hidden bodies that the police had searched for but never found. He was pulling back the curtain on every lie he had ever told. As the clock ticked toward the final 30 minutes, Sung called the lawyer back into the room. He handed over a stack of legal documents that he had prepared in a rush of desperate energy. In one final, shocking move, he signed his name at the bottom of a special contract. He was not giving his billions of dollars to his gang or to his distant relatives. He was signing over his entire estate, the hotels, the ships, the towers, and the mountains of cash, to a foundation that helped the victims of organized crime. He was giving his wealth to the very people he had stepped on to get it. The lawyer stared at the papers in shock. "You are leaving yourself with nothing," he whispered. "By the time the sun comes up, your name will be gone from every building. You will own nothing but the clothes on your back." Sung looked at the lawyer, and for the first time his eyes looked clear. "I have owned everything, and it felt like a prison," Sung said quietly. "Maybe if I own nothing, I can finally be free." He felt a strange weight lift from his chest as he handed over the keys to his kingdom. He was stripping himself of his power, his money, and his pride. He was going to his death not as a king, but as a man who had finally admitted he was wrong. He knew it was too late for a happy ending, but at least the truth was finally out in the open. The butcher was gone, and only the man remained. The heavy iron door opened for the last time. The sound was not loud, but it felt like a clap of thunder in the small, silent cell. The guards stepped in, their faces stiff and serious. They did not need to use handcuffs this time. Sung-woon stood up slowly, his legs feeling heavy but steady. He looked at the empty table, the cold soup, and the yellow file that had changed everything. He took a deep breath, straightened his gray uniform, and stepped out into the long white hallway. The walk felt like it lasted 1,000 years. As he walked, he passed the guards who had once feared him and the men who had once served him. He didn't look down at the floor anymore. He kept his head up. He looked at the cold walls and the flickering lights, but his mind was somewhere else.
He felt a strange sense of peace that he had never known in his palace. The burden of being a king, the weight of the lies, and the hunger for power had all fallen away. He had given up his money and his secrets, and in doing so, he had finally found a way to breathe. As he reached the end of the hall, he stopped for a second and looked directly at the security camera on the wall. It was as if he were looking through the lens and speaking to everyone who had ever known his name. He didn't look angry, and he didn't look like a monster. He looked relieved. A small, tired smile touched his lips because he knew the truth was finally free. He wasn't running anymore. He stepped into the final room where the air was still and the shadows were long. Outside the thick prison walls, the rain continued to fall over the city of Busan. A young woman stood alone near the iron gates, her umbrella tilted against the wind. She didn't have a sign, and she didn't say a word. She just waited, listening to the rhythm of the rain. Suddenly, a dull, muffled thud echoed from deep inside the stone building, the sound of a heavy wooden door falling open. The girl didn't cry. She didn't cheer. She simply closed her eyes and took a long, deep breath of the wet, fresh air. The shadow that had followed her for 15 years was finally gone. She turned away from the prison, walking toward the bright lights of the city and into a future where she could finally be herself. He spent his life trying to be a king. He spent his last 4 hours trying to be a human. In the end, he was just a ghost.